Today I'm so excited to just share the pleasure of enjoying poetry together for the afternoon. Can't think of a much better way for us to spend the afternoon together. And as I was thinking this morning about this opportunity and bringing this year's very first author to campus, I started thinking about poetry and what poetry means and the definition of poetry and why it's so important and what makes a poem a poem. And so, of course, what do? You Google. And I found a quote by Sandburg, who is one of my favorite poets, and he says, "Poetry is the journal of the sea animal living on land, wanting to fly in the air. Poetry is the search for syllables to shoot at the barriers of the unknown and the unknowable. Poetry is a phantom script telling how rainbows are made and why they go away." So I now want to invite our resident, one of our resident WKCTC poets and faculty member, Britton Shirley, who can properly introduce Mr. Perry. He is the one who initially invited Mr. Perry to come here and introduced me to his poetry. And so I think that he certainly deserves that opportunity. But I do want to close with a quote from another one of my favorite American poets, who is Walt Whitman. And he said, "To have great poets, there must be great audiences too." So thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. It's nice to have such a good turnout today. And I'm thrilled to introduce such a strong poet. Nathaniel Perry's debut collection, 9 Acres, was chosen as the winner of the 2011 American Poetry Review Honickman First Book Prize. And as poet Morris Manning writes, it is a beautiful, subtle, and important book. As I read 9 Acres, the words of Wendell Berry, a fellow agrarian, echoed in my head. In his fabulous essay, Think Little, Berry writes that the discipline of thought is not generalization. It is detail and it is personal behavior. A man who is trying to live as a neighbor to his neighbors will have a lively and practical understanding of peace and brotherhood. A couple who makes a good marriage and raises healthy, morally competent children are serving the world's future more directly and surely than any political leader. A good farmer who is dealing with the problem of soil erosion on an acre of ground has a sounder grasp of that problem and cares more about it than any bureaucrat who is talking about it in general. 9 Acres resonates with Berry's wisdom through its attention to the smaller details of life that many of us overlook. In a very real sense, these poems are ingrained with these ideals, with the hard work of stewardship, the careful cultivation of land, the love of a tightly knit family, the attention to the power of language. Throughout this collection, we see a man breaking ground in the garden, sweating through his shirt as the tiller bucks and groans. We feel the joy of a father as his son fills a bucket with raspberries, and the dread of a husband as he dreams of his young wife's death. Though the tones of these poems shift from hope to fear, from joy to regret, the attention to language never wavers. Each of these 52 poems employing a strict meter and form. Perry's poems are deeply rooted to the power of both land and language. As he writes in the final poem, "In seed and land we find an anchor, and in language we weigh out our courage." Please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Perry.
Thank you, Britton, so much for that wonderful introduction. I should probably just sit down and just let that stand. It's wonderful to have such a good friend introduce me at such an occasion. Though, as I said to Britton's class earlier today, it does sort of remove the veneer of professionalism, because Britton knows I'm generally full of whatever I'm full of. But it's just wonderful to be here. I love Kentucky. I've spent a little bit of time here, but everyone I know from Kentucky are just about the best people there are, which is its greatest thing I have to recommend it to me. But so anyway, so thanks again for having me, and thanks for coming out. I'm glad Britton did that, because now I don't have to introduce the book at all. So now the book is essentially a project that began a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, in which I encountered an old book called 5 Acres and Independence by a fellow named M.G. Keynes, who was a government soil scientist. And this is a book essentially that was written in the 30s when people were interested in, during the Depression, in leaving towns and trying to grow some food on their own. And it was sort of embraced in the 60s during the Back to the Land movement and continues to sort of live on. But it's a wonderful book, very witty and pithy, full of good tips like how to dig your own septic system and how to build a refrigerator. But I was enamored by the style of it and the titles. And so all the titles in my book steal the titles from that book. So that's the way it's organized. But anyhow, before I get to that, I thought I'd start with some poems by somebody else. In the old days of poetry readings, over half the poems read would not be those of the author. It wasn't quite the ego fest that it is now. So I thought I'd at least temper my own ego a little by reading somebody else's poems. I teach at a college out in Virginia, and right now I'm teaching Longfellow, which is decidedly unhip, but that's me in a nutshell. So I thought I'd start with 2 poems by Longfellow as a way to start us off here. These are 2 little sonnets, one called The Harvest Moon, which is seasonal, and the other just one I love. So this is the first one, Harvest Moon. It is the harvest moon, on gilded vanes and roofs of villages, on woodland crests and their aerial neighborhoods of nests, deserted on the curtained window panes, of rooms where children sleep on country lanes and harvest fields, its mystic splendor rests. Gone are the birds that were our summer guests, with the last sheaves return the laboring wains. All things are symbols. The external shows of nature have their image in the mind. As flowers and fruits and falling of the leaves, the songbirds leave us at the summer's close. Only the empty nests are left behind, and pipings of the quail among the sheaves. That's the harvest moon. See, Britton and I can't complain about the kids whining because they're ours. So it's good. I'd rather them be happy. This is one more poem by Longfellow called Nature. And in these 2 poems are some of the things my poems also deal with. So another good introduction. Nature. As a fond mother, when the day is over, leads by the hand her little child to bed, half willing, half reluctant to be led, and leave his broken playthings on the floor, still gazing at them through the open door, nor wholly reassured and comforted by promises of others in their stead, which though more splendid may not please him more, so nature deals with us and takes away our playthings one by one, and by the hand leads us to rest so gently that we go, scarce knowing if we wish to go or stay, being too full of sleep to understand how far the unknown transcends the what we know. So that's Longfellow for you. Somebody else's voice to start us off here. All right, I thought I'd read a few poems from the book, and then maybe a few new poems, and then maybe a few more poems from the book. We'll see how much we've got time for. I'll just start by reading the first few poems in the book. The trouble with this book is that it has a project that I just explained. So now there's not a lot of sort of witty, pithy stories I can introduce each poem with, which is usually, the way of things. So kind of the poems are sort of self-explanatory. So I apologize if I'm not as witty as you would have wanted. But maybe the poems will stand in for them. So I'll just read the first few in the book, the first 4 or 5 or 6 as the way I introduce the book, and it'll be the way I introduce it to you as well. The first poem is called, fittingly, Introduction. Remember, these are chapter titles. So, Introduction. I'll start this with an ending, or something like an ending. At least there's tension and fading light. In the backfield, our neighbor Lee's long field behind us, we were sliding along the muddy pasture road, the dogs, the boy, and I all out for a walk at dusk. When a coyote, bright as tomorrow, opened and shut and opened again the wood's dark doors, then stilled to stand and look at us. The dogs trembled and communicated with a quickening of every muscle, while I tried just to read the animal's face. But all I got was the starkness of form, that which hunts before me, that which is not dark in the darkness. The next one's called The Farm to Choose. Where the gravel easement straightens out into the swale, they say is there to hide a spring that only shows its face in the strongest rains. Where the rise rises up to what we will refer to as the meadow or future orchard. Where the woods reach out along the drive, their shadows to us and to the meadow. Where the driveway turns again, now hard, beside what soon will be the garden, once we educate the yard from being yard to being soil. Where the house in a high place stands with its young eyes, I think from here I can make out sure signs of land. I didn't use the chapter titles in the order they are in the book, though that one was early, obviously, but I did move them around a little bit, so hopefully you won't mind. This next one's about, if any of you grow vegetables, you know that come January you start salivating over the seed catalogs and wondering what will fail next year in your garden. And this one has to do with that. Vegetable crops to avoid and to choose. We need the right varieties. Spring shell peas for half-full sun, the long breakfast radishes that grow well here and on your tongue sparkle like spun light. Potatoes we can dig when they are new. When we were new or smaller-hearted, we did not care at all for the few things that matter to us now. I'm still learning what that's to do with this catalog of seeds we're pacing through, but if someone knows, it's you who have traced such lines in the garden, you I follow with all my eyes. We'll get the carrots right this year. We'll tend to the baby when he cries. I wrote that poem before the older one was born back there. And he did a fair amount of crying. And we tried to tend to him. And we still tried. This next one's about chickens. Anybody have chickens? All right, me too. We just got a new rooster because the last one got ate by the coyote in the aforementioned first poem, the aforementioned coyote. This one's called Poultry. Red Star, Black Star, Golden Comet, Buttercup, Buckeye, Delaware, Wyandotte, Orpington, Plymouth Rock, Cochin, Lamona, Chanticleer, and Crèvecoeur, and Black-tailed Banty, Leghorn, Phoenix, Buff, and Red. Malay, Sultan, Sussex, and Jersey Giant. I could go on, but instead will not give in to just this language and all its smaller charms today. I need the eggs for breakfast. So how about we make a deal and say I'll give in to the eggs and then the hens as we play our little game. My ducking in the coop, they're calling softly out my singular name. This one's called Essential Factors of Production. The book more or less starts in the early spring and moves through a year. There are 52 poems, and somebody who was smarter than me pointed out that there are 52 weeks in a year, and I thought, aha, that's how I will organize it. So these are all the spring poems. This one's called Essential Factors of Production. I'll make a dirty joke. You'll cringe, but maybe later acquiesce. The seedlings spread beneath our lights will slowly draw their backwards breaths. The peas are in before the rain. It's cold, but they don't mind the cold so much. I know you hate this rain, frigid on your hands, but fold the empty envelopes of seed with satisfaction nonetheless. The ground shows little of what we've done, but insignificance, I guess, is still a signal of some kind. Our secrets, hidden and so unharmed, we're sure will soon transform us, or will at least return to us transformed. You do a lot of work and you put seeds in the ground and then there's nothing, right? And then you wait and you think, surely they should be up by now. And then only the radishes ever come up. This next one's called Remaking a Neglected Orchard. Some of these poems are kind of invented. We don't have an orchard. I wish we did. But were we to have one, it might go a little something like this. That's one of the little secrets about writing fiction and poetry, is you get to lie a lot of the time, and people think you're telling the truth. So I think what you're shooting for is the truth with a capital T most of the time. Most of these are true with a little t too, but this one not so much. Remaking a Neglected Orchard. It was a good idea, cutting away the vines and ivy, trimming back the chest-high thicket lazy years had let grow here. Though it wasn't for lack of love for the trees, I'd like to point out. Years love trees in a way we can't imagine. They just don't use the fruit like us. They want instead the slant of sun through narrow branches, the buckshot of rain on these old cherries. And we, now that I think on it, want those things too. We just always and desperately want the sugar of the fruit, the best we'll get from this irascible land, a sweetness we can gather for years, new stains staining the stains on our hands. This next one's called, this is my favorite chapter title in the book, Tried and True Ways to Fail. And in the book, it lists all the ways you can screw up your small farm, which is most ways. If any of you know farmers, it's pretty much an exercise of not failing. There's an old joke that I told my neighbor Lee, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, that I heard it somewhere on the radio. A farmer wins the lottery, and they ask him what he's going to do with his millions, and he says, "Well, I expect I'll just keep farming until it's gone." So that's about how it goes. This is called Tried and True Ways to Fail. Cut the tree with a bent bow saw. When the blade bucks and sticks in the heart of the fallen pine, try to free it with your gloveless hand. Seek art in the winds wrestling the trees. Decide what your children will think about something like difficult art up in the pines, or imagine them always happy and running. Brace your strength with a foot on the trunk to the left of the buried blade. Pull with everything in you. When you fall, unbalanced, notice the maples are full of color or filling up like a glass of water. Everything you can see is filling or full. The boy is starting to crawl. The saw is still in the tree. I'll read a few more from the book before I read some new stuff. These next three poems feature my neighbor Lee, who I just mentioned. Lee would be well, he knows he's in the poems, but Lee is a very private individual. His family's owned his land for 250 years. Lee lives in a trailer and has, acres worth about many times what I am worth, which isn't much. But Lee's also the sweetest man I know. And it's interesting, if you know country people, they don't always think the same way you do. They don't always think the same things you do. They don't always treat their things and animals the way you would, but there's still always a goodness to them. And that's how I feel about Lee. But anyway, I hope he doesn't mind that I use him in these poems. So there's a couple with my neighbor in them. This first one's called Farm Finance. Next door or not next door, all we share is a field and a rutted road. I hear Lee this morning hitching up his tractor, the diesel yawn and a load of silage clanking across the field, headed for another field. He told me they lost the place once in the 30s, the cows, the work, the yield, not enough even to pay taxes. Lee wasn't there to see it, not born, of course, but the family bought it back, fields and field roads all still worn with the ruts they'd made. The place is still unchanged by years, the hills, the swaying wheat, the carts of rot, and the kind of debt that Lee is out there paying. Next one's called Cropping Systems. Lee stopped his putting feed corn in to tell me that his father died. He said the place didn't really seem like much of a farm anymore. His shy face not shy in the evening sun or in the grief still warm in him. He came down from the tractor while we talked it over, cut the engine to hear me better, though I didn't have much to say that wasn't already clear in the slow stretch of oats and meadow behind us. The sun restudied our bodies in shadow as we turned away from dying and spoke of hay and drought, as if to say, that's all we ever really know anything about. And this one's called Storage of Fruits and Vegetables, moving towards the end of summer here. Well, the melons didn't grow as big as you would have liked them to. The corns made ears the size of those giant pencils you get as a kid, which it's true are big for pencils, but for corn, not what we'd imagined exactly. Lee made fun of me a little, his acres of corn waving calmly in the sun. But our potatoes came in like gold, like loaves of buried bread. Beans are canned and stacked inside like numbers in a table. The dead are still dead, I'm afraid, but we've tried. We try to live off this life nonetheless. Look up. Our beans have reached the tops of the poles I set in the ground, and they will not stop. So I'll stop there for a second and read some new poems. I'll read the 3 poems that Britton so kindly decided to publish in the magazine he's starting here, Exit 7, which I do believe will be published in the next couple months. So I appreciate the honor, and all of you should buy a copy and come to the reading launch. I assume there'll be some sort of event. If not, there should be. So anyway, I'll read you those 3 poems, and then maybe a section of a long new thing I started, and then a couple more from the book, and then we'll send you to the reception table. The first 2 come from a project I've been working on. The next book idea I have will be centered by a long poem that I've begun, which is weird. I'll read you a little bit of it. And then there's a suite of poems for each of my children, 2 of which are running around here making noise, and the 3rd of which may arrive while we're here if my wife ever doesn't get to sit down. So anyway, these 2 are from a set of poems for the little girl, Jane Bell, and they all have titles of different moons. You know, the Native Americans, the Algonquins particularly, had funny names for the moons. Harvest moon being one of them, worm moon, sturgeon moon, heat moon, snow moon, and so on. I'll read 2, worm moon and harvest moon. First one, worm moon. I wait up sometimes to see the moon come up all orange and fat and think how you would love to see it. I can cover it with my thumb. I never used to see this time of night. To bed with the dogs and hens, I like to say, but sometimes things get out of hand, just some. When I'm up too late, I never know until the morning stretches its spine out over the trees out back, a most glorious and always scene. But I'm shot. I take the dogs out for a piss, a cardinal shouting somewhere, Germany, Germany, and I have no idea what he means. When you are older still, and stiller too, we'll walk the morning, its trembling paths of light, of dew. I'll be better then, awake. But don't you wake yet, little one, little promise. The worm moon was huge and out for you, a primrosy orange, and I've caught it here for grace and for our sake. And then I'll read my version of the Harvest Moon poem, I suppose, Longfellow's poem that I read at the beginning. It is sweet potato digging time right now, if anybody has sweet potatoes, and that's this poem has to do about. The last thing I dig out of my garden, at least. Harvest Moon. Grow a sweet potato and tell me there's no God. 4 months of vine, and then its morning glory blossoms, needless and perfect, just purple and open to the rainless world. And what I mean about the root, which is not, as you know, a potato at all, but instead a bit of swollen luck, is that hope asks us to plan for the future. So in May you set out slips, plucked from last year's harvest in hilled up rows, and then the hoe if there's time, if you don't have the wonder of living, breathing, and eating most minutes of the day. But even when you do, and you find yourself forgetting the vines, there'll be those perfect flowers, and you'll remember that the moon you saw the night before through the window while the little one screamed and wouldn't sleep was the harvest moon. And in the next few days, you'll heel your fork into the ground, and the flesh you'll find will be yours, and holy, and orange, and sweet. So those are poems for the little girl. And then the other poem that Britton so kindly is going to feature is from the set of poems for the older one who's running around with a hamburger on his shirt. I don't know where that shirt came from. What a bizarre shirt if you see him. You don't know where your kid's clothes from. Have you ever had that experience? You like pull something out of a drawer and you're like, all right, it's going on. So this one is from a set of poems called An Invitation to Raish, which is his name, Raish, short for Horatio. And I stole the title from a poet named George Scarborough, who I read in Britton's class just now, who has a poem for one of his younger brothers called An Invitation to Kim. These poems imagine Raish as an older child, just old enough to read maybe, and me talking to him and saying, I'm really not as bad or dumb as I seemed when I was raising you. It's interesting, I wrote these poems before he was born. And I've been working on the other poems, obviously, since becoming a father. So there's maybe a different kind of thinking going on in these. Maybe more naive, but it's there. So this one's called In Trees Looking for the Mountains. Do you remember when you first saw rain turn into snow and then turn back to rain? Did you wonder if it would also be the same with you? Prayed for, then light and beautiful, then gray and slicking the darkened roads the whole rest of the night? Well, despite lulls here and there in the pattern, it is a bit like that. Though the roads are long and shine out in the fat of night all along their miles. And isn't that important? Knowing you can always go away somewhere, or somewhere always know a low, good light might bring you home. The snow you saw is piled in little mountains along the road. The song of what you know is the song in your head when you head back home, and is long but worth the singing, I'd say. Once in the woods I could not find my way. Confused, I stood in trees looking for the mountains that should have been there just beyond my sight line. There was nothing but field and meadow there. I stood transfixed in the sinking forest air. I sang out to the mountains to find me, and they found me when I turned the other way around. But I put that song away and have not been found so easily again. So when you feel your snow unbinding back to rain, you will feel cheated. You'll wonder if you'll ever heal. But the sound of rain in trees and on the road, the sound of what you knew and what it showed you, is all the song you need if you'll take the load. So that's that. That's my first and maybe only attempt at rhyming 3 lines in a row. Turns out hard to make it work. Maybe it didn't work. I don't know. As you maybe could tell, I'm a relatively formal writer. I work almost always in meter and rhyme. I'm not really sure why this happened. As I said to Britton's class, I'm not really as boring as that makes me sound. I don't think. But it's just a way that I've learned to organize my thinking, and it's what's kind of in a weird way freed me. Frost said, writing poetry without form or meter is like playing tennis without a net, and for me, it's true for me. I think good writers in free verse find that net in something else, but for me, it creates a kind of it gives me something to start with. When I look at just a blank page, and if I were writing in free verse, I would think, oh no, a blank page. What do I do with it now? But writers like Britton can manage that fear. I can't. So I have to have something to move me on. But this next thing I'm going to read, I haven't read any of this out loud before in public, so you get a treat, I suppose. This is from a long poem I've been working on. That will be the middle of the next book. And just to tell you a little bit of what you know, I'm trying to do something a little different in this poem. B, maybe a little wilder, though it is still in rhyme and meter. Not that wild. But it's a long poem, and it centers around a scandal that occurred near where I live in Virginia at one of the Randolphs, as in John Randolph's plantation homes, and the house was called Bizarre. And when I drive to school every day, I see the historical marker, and I think, that is such a strange name for a house. And nobody knows why it's called that. There are theories that it just looked funny, and it was called Bizarre for that reason. There are theories that it was a local name for a wildflower, Bizarre. But anyhow, that's the name, and spelled with an I, not an A, so Bizarre. But anyhow, at this house, to get the scandal real quickly, Nancy Randolph, one of the younger Randolphs, became pregnant, and she was not married, which was a scandal. And the suspicion was her brother-in-law, who was married to her sister. And they took a carriage up to Cumberland, which is about 20 miles north of where I live from Bizarre. And there was some screams in the middle of the night and some rushing around on the stairs. And the next morning there was blood on the stairs, and she was high on laudanum or whatever they put people on in the early 19th century, 18th century, late 18th century. And then there was slaves claimed to have discovered a baby's body outside the next morning. So they were put on trial for infanticide and, of course, acquitted because slaves' testimony didn't count for anything. But it ruined their reputations, of course, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not that interested in the scandal. There have been lots of bad historical novels and bad historical dramas and other bad historical things written about this scandal because people love a good scandal, right? But what I'm interested in this poem is the idea of using that story as a kind of metaphor for parenting. I know that sounds a little weird, and I know it's weird. But something was born, something intangible, that you can't really put your hands on, and that's kind of what children are like too. And also weirdly creeping into this poem are Ezekiel, the prophet, and also a little-known banjo player from Virginia. So that's pretty much all you need to know. When you hear references to wheels, that'll be Ezekiel. When you hear references to the Randolphs, that's the story. So I'll read you this is a little bit of the second section of this poem, and the poem is about a 30-page poem, and this is probably just three or so pages of it. And then I'll return to the more normal stuff. So this is from Bazaar. All the sections kind of come together syntactically, so I'm going to be starting in the middle of the sentence. Forgive me. And our children are the decisions we can't control. Like a rumor, they move and grow apart from us. Like a dream, they remind us of ourselves without ourselves. Like prophecies, they seem so just and unjust all at once. Ezekiel was told by God to eat the scroll which held his words, though all the almost prophet could see was the title, always represented in three parts in translation, laments and mourning and woe, though the Hebrew seems to have something more like lamentations, etc., which, while less poetic, seems like a better door into the truth of the thing. This prophet was given little good to say. Some translations, in fact, have the mourning as moaning, which makes the delivery of the word something like a birth, a riven human body asked to bring to the world something of them, but not themselves. In many of our cultures, women prepare and eat their afterbirth for health, the only sweetmeat a soul might require. And right there in testimony, Ezekiel says the scroll was like honey filling his belly. And so like a mother, he'd reabsorbed a word he had yet to preach into his willing body. So the child is born and swallowed all at once, and we are filled with sweetness and the sick taste of knowing we've been cornered and asked for the first real time to bear a lasting witness. Come, all you good time people, while I've got money to spend, or time at least to tell you something, and I'll tell you another dream. This one doesn't have a second dream inside, but is funny in the way it stretches the concept of metaphor or symbolism or whatever we take our dreams to be these days. I dreamed my children were the music of Doc Boggs. And what I mean is not that he was them writ large or they were him in miniature, tiny banjos strapped to their dream necks, but that they in the dream became the music. They dematerialized the same way ash to the eye becomes the air around it. And at first they tried to be Danville Girl, then Sugar Baby, and even his version of Oh Death, but of course they landed on country blues, the breath of the banjo's strange high string somehow visible in the dream like a vision. Well, I said no new dream in the dream, but maybe I lied. Or a visitation. Going back to old Virginia from my last game, they sang to me. Though being all under 5, they are not gamblers or drinkers just yet, as Boggs was sometimes, when he wasn't dazed down in the mine or busy being discovered for the first time and then a second time. Why the blues, I yelled in the dream, at the whirling sound that was my children. But they could only answer by being that repeated banjo dirge. Boom ding a boom a ding dang ding, boom ding a boom a ding dang ding. Go dig a hole in the meadow, good people. Go dig a hole in the ground. And by his own admission, the soul of country blues is another song, Hustlin' Gamblers, which Boggs learned from a traveling photographer who also knew a lot of old music and probably loved corn whiskey just as well. And Boggs adapted the song then to the style he'd heard, famously eavesdropping on a black dance in the 1920s town of Norton, Virginia. The way he describes it, he was in a trance of boyhood envy, of wanting to play like what he'd seen and heard, like what he wasn't supposed to have seen or heard. Doc Boggs never cottoned to the claw-hammer style he learned as a boy and used instead a 3-finger guitar-like method he devised himself after peeping in on that dance, mind you. And he sang not just hymns, but murder ballads and mountain songs and whiskey songs and the blues, as you know already from the ringing dream I've interrupted here. The reason for all this technical information is to impress on you that Boggs's music, dark, uncleaned, was like a kind of birth for him, something unexpectedly shimmering and troubling, made from his own soul and the soul of the land he was raised on. And there is one other thing, that many of these mountain songs, Hustle and Gambler too, most likely were originally only sung, one lone voice deepening the story and sadness of the tune, the creeping pain of living expanding in the cracks of the unaccompanied singer. So Boggs put music where there was none. He laid down the banjo like a child into the cradle, an accompaniment, a wild howl that fit like a hand around a candle, the howls it was joining. When I am dead and buried, my pale face turned to the sun, good people, my children sang out in the dream, a wail of prefiguring death, the failure of any good prophecy I'd held to, when suddenly before the song was over, they reappeared as sunflowers, night-black centers in wheels of gold, a wheel of darkness within a wheel of light. And I ran for them and embraced their rough stalks, and the pollen from their faces dusted down into my hair, on my feet. We are all of us good people, I heard myself telling them, the best we can manage. And I felt right then in the dream I got the portion of gladness I'd be allowed in this life. Later I looked online for the song and found with it a photo of Boggs. He's long into life, retired from the mines, remade at Newport in the 60s. His banjo stuck on its wheel of pain and fear and beauty, his face the face of a man who can't believe his luck, his own rebirth. The music born again as he too was born into the second half of the 20th century. Nancy's second life was quieter than Doc's, but she was a wife and a mother and the mistress of another house which her world did not fall down around. They both carried something inside them for so long. Nancy, the scandal story, Doc Boggs, the sound of his mountain town of the mines, which is also a kind of story. We are all parents to our children over and over again, and our children are our stories. Small tales that keep us up in the winding half-dark of a summer night, that tell us who we might have been, that forgive us for what we'll do to them, that teach us again about spring, that retune our fifth strings, that seem just by pointing to light the moon, that become our moons and then we theirs, stories that seem somehow to end each year and then begin again, stories we wrote but will never understand. Between 1931 and when he was asked again to play in the early 60s, Doc Boggs didn't even own a banjo. He returned to the mines, to Virginia, to his only wife, who wouldn't brook the blues he'd sung, the way he'd earned his money in the 20s. He made his records, got run out of Norton by the law, and lay his banjo back down deep into his heart. Nancy Randolph put her blues where it would stay, hers, also in the heart. When she married in 1809 in New York, she felt the happiness of the story restarting, the blues less blue by degrees. These swallowed stories may seem like mysteries, but nothing was hidden, just absorbed and retold. So what are we hiding? Hold me up to the light. You'll see this day's small story. My son chasing a rooster in the rain light of dawn. My daughter smearing honey through her hair. Me dragging him screaming to the porch for harassing the animal. Me stupidly furious for having to wash her at midday. We pick our own blues. We roll our own scrolls and choke them down. Dig a hole in the meadow, good people. Go dig a hole in the ground. After the trial will be silence. I'll bury myself in the mines. I'll wait for the story to turn, to change keys, to refine me in its cadence. Now that goes on for pages and pages. I mean, who wants to read that? That's the problem. You start working on a long poem, you're like, who's going to read a 30-page poem? Now, even I get tired of reading it when I'm trying to work on it. But anyhow, so we'll return to the country world here for the last couple poems, and I thank you for coming again. I'll just read a few more from the 9 Acres book. And it is interesting now working on poems with children that are already somewhat grown. And these poems really are more about a marriage and the potential of children. So this next one's called Compost. Not a very beautiful title for a poem, but it's what I had to work with. Though compost is itself beautiful. Compost. Desire is what we make of it. New stretch of soil, old patch of soil. We want more food, So add a row and scare strips made from aluminum foil hung from the lowest branches of trees nearby and coat hangers stabbed in the ground. Deer approach and shy away with a slight sound, a slippery sound like the sun if it made one as it closes days. But the sun is silent, which is exactly what we want. Soft fleeing, like words that slowly leave us. The sun in the garden says it for one won't leave us yet. It's not that we get what we want exactly, but that want, if we want it, is all we get. This next one's called Green Manures and Cover Crops. A lot of these poems ended up being about my wife. She used to complain when we were younger, when I was in grad school with Britton, that I didn't write enough poems to her. Now I think she wishes I would stop. This one was written for some occasion, like an anniversary or a birthday, when I was likely in trouble and trying to make up for it. Marriages are like children, right? Good. This is called Green Manures and Cover Crops. Is there a center in all of this, or only field peas in flower, or just our meadow peas in flower? Yes, all of it, and they, as they must be, are only ours, and you are only mine, and of course ours as well, which is the same as mine for now, while we are undevoured, which will not last, and will not last because it seems it will until the evening ends exactly as it ended here tonight. Still, with light in the trees and storms somewhere out towards Prospect, which is to say forever. But stay with me like peas in the meadow, which is to say always. See how I'm doing on time here. I'll just read 3 more and I'll let you go. This next one's called Selection of Tree Fruits. A fall poem. Haylight, the ripened light of evening at bailing time, third cut, late September, makes songs with what it finds as if it were not weighted with autumn's burden, which is, I'll admit, all we want right now. We're sick of green, of weeds reseeding, lurid pokeberries bunched and fat. The season's mean with an open, metaphorical kind of discipline. The walnuts are thick with walnuts, but stripped by wind of leaves. Persimmons soften for our sake. I'll strain them for their pulp when they are almost rotten. We'll celebrate the sweetness of decline, fall's little ditty, where mercy rhymes with fate. This next one is my favorite one in the book. I don't know why. I just like it. It has to do with me trying to see some animals that always fly away from me because they hate me. And I would like to watch them some, but they don't want to see me. And that feeling of being abandoned by the natural world, which happens all the time if you spend some time in it. And the poem is called, this was the hardest one to write as well, because I just didn't know what to do with this title. I wrote 3 or 4 different versions of this poem, which were all completely different. This poem is called Sewage Disposal. This was not one of the ones for my wife. You don't title an anniversary poem Sewage Disposal. Those of you who are taking notes, it doesn't get you very far. Sewage disposal. There's a pair of wood ducks at the pond. They scare away each time I turn the corner to the berm that holds the water back from the woods. I've learned at least that when I yell at them to stay, their flight already past begun, their backs and scoldings soaked with morning sun, there is a lasting echo. Wait, wait, wait. But it's always too late. I guess I've never seen them in an honest sense, if honesty is our endeavor here, though I'm not sure that's all we're good for, to flush and call after our shames. What could I admit to the ducks, the pond, that wouldn't come back the same? I guess I would want to use the ducks as my psychoanalyst or something. All right, this is the last poem. As the poem will explain, the second edition of 5 Acres and Independence cut 1 chapter from the end. And that chapter was called The Farm Library. In my copy of M.G. Keynes's 5 Acres and Independence, a 1970s reprint of the 1940s making sense of the obsolescence of the first printing from 1935, a once final chapter, The Farm Library, is omitted, but for the ghost of its title on the copyright page, which duly explains the surgery almost as if the revelation itself was a new kind of pain. What did Cain's, his skiff of a book shored up, his harvest stored for winter, need me to know of knowledge? That in seed and land we find an anchor, and in language we weigh out our courage. Thank you.